Contents have it. I'm just allowing a moment for anybody who wishes to leave the chamber to do so, my lord. My lords, motion for debate, the Horn of Africa, Lord Collins of Highbury.
My lords, I want to just start by saying that I welcome the opportunity to have an in-depth debate about the rising tensions in the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti and Somalia. I think we've had some really excellent contributions, and I'm determined that as we go forward as a government, we do give this House the opportunity to have a proper debate on these issues. And of course, rising tensions in the Horn of Africa matter significantly to the United Kingdom, and these tensions are further destabilising the region, which risks having knock-on effects on the ability of the United Kingdom and regional and international partners to counter al-Shabaab. As a result, the United Kingdom's capacity to advance growth, climate and development partnerships in the region could be jeopardised with worsening political instability and security environment. I recognise both the importance and the complexity of the issues contributing to these tensions. Despite other pressing global conflicts, we must not overlook the potential of the Horn of Africa. Yet the multiple concurrent challenges it faces, be it security, humanitarian or development, hinders its ability to realise that potential. But we must not give up on it. Since 2019, the United Kingdom has allocated more than £1 billion across East Africa towards humanitarian operations, helping to reach tens of millions of people with life-saving support. However, despite the progress made, the United Nations estimates around 63 million people will still require humanitarian aid this year. That is a staggering number of people in desperate need of help, and this is due to the combination of pressures, including a drought of unprecedented severity and duration, as well as flooding and conflict. To make matters worse, the situation in the Horn has been grown more tense in recent months. At the beginning of this year, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a memorandum of understanding, which could grant Ethiopia access to the sea in return for Ethiopian recognition of Somaliland. This has subsequently led to a worrying deterioration in relations between Ethiopia and Somalia, and drawn in other regional actors such as Egypt and Eritrea as well. Together with international partners, the United Kingdom has reaffirmed its support for Somalia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, while Turkey is leading mediation efforts between Ethiopia and Somalia. As the United Kingdom, we are supportive of Turkey's attempts to initiate dialogue between the two countries, and we welcome their engagement on this issue. I will now take both Somalia and Ethiopia in turn to expand on this. First, Somalia. This is a critical time for the region as the African Union's peacekeeping mission in Somalia will transition into a new mission. Crucial details still need to be finalised regarding the mission structure and the associated force, including which countries will contribute troops. And there are still unresolved issues regarding the funding of a future mission. In recent years, the United Kingdom, alongside the EU, has been a core donor to the African Union's mission in Somalia. But we fear without a sustainable funding mechanism drawn from a broader base of donors for a future mission, the crucial security gains made in recent years will be lost. Moving to Ethiopia, my lords, only recently we marked the 40th anniversary of the 1984 famine, and we've also we have also recently addressed a question relating to the tensions in the Horn. As I've repeatedly said, Ethiopia is a country of unbridled possibilities, with innovative population, an expanding economy and a rich history. Yet challenges persist, and we continue to raise them with their government. That includes finding political solutions to internal conflicts, which have a devastating impact on civilians, particularly women and girls. The Ethiopia-Somaliland MOU risks bringing further instability to a region that is already engaged in tackling issues such as conflict, food insecurity and terrorism, whilst also posing a threat to Somalia's territorial integrity. And that comes on top of already tense relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea, making it all more necessary that we do everything possible to de-escalate tensions. My Lords, to conclude, it's clear that the rising tensions and deteriorating relationships in the Horn of Africa have been exacerbated by the signing of the MOU. The United Kingdom and the international community remain focused on a diplomatic approach aimed at finding a mutually agreeable solution by encouraging dialogue between the parties. It is, however, crucial to avoid any action that could destabilise regional security. Before I finish, I just want to add a bit about Sudan, because we can't talk about the Horn of Africa without acknowledging the serious situation there. And I do know that Sudan is a matter of deep concern to many peers across the House. Since conflict erupted between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces in April last year, Sudan has witnessed one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Over 24 million people urgently need humanitarian assistance, and famine has been confirmed in northern Darfur. Humanitarian access continues to be deliberately blocked, and atrocities are being committed on a horrific scale. In response, this year the United Kingdom has provided £113.5 million in aid to support both those fleeing violence in Sudan and in neighbouring countries. And the United Kingdom continues to be at the forefront of efforts to respond to this crisis. Most recently, on the 18th of October, we led a joint statement together with 10 other donors to condemn the obstruction of aid and call upon the warring parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. And we continue to pursue all diplomatic avenues to press the parties into a permanent ceasefire, allow unrestricted humanitarian access, protect civilians, and commit to a sustained and meaningful peace process. Additionally, as we prepare to assume the presidency of the United Nations Security Council in November, the United Kingdom will push for actionable steps to protect civilians in Sudan in alignment with recent UN recommendations. The United Kingdom's commitment to Sudan remains strong, with continued advocacy for peace, accountability and relief for the Sudanese people. That concludes my statement, my Lords.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, can I first thank the Minister, Lord Collins, for initiating this debate and for his collaborative nature involving us in these discussions. And I look forward to the maiden speech of the noble Lady Baroness Harman, who I'm sure will play a full part in your Lordship's House going forward. I must begin, though, by questioning the title of today's debate. And whilst His Majesty's government may not formally recognise Somaliland, failing to acknowledge its 6.2 million people does not make them invisible. To speak of tensions in the region whilst omitting the most democratic and stable society within it is in effect to disregard an entire nation from our discourse. Somaliland's people are committed to democratic principles that outshine any of its neighbours, yet they find themselves absent from the very title of our discussion. Well, my Lords, today we find ourselves addressing a matter of both immediate and long-term consequence in the Horn of Africa. Specifically with regard to Somaliland, there exists a unique opportunity for the United Kingdom to act in accordance with our moral responsibilities and strategic interests. Somaliland's democratic development offers, as I said, a stark contrast to the persistent instability of its neighbour Somalia, and presents a prospect for stability across a region long beset by conflict. And with our support, Somaliland could contribute to the security of one of the world's most vital maritime corridors. Since declaring independence in 1991, Somaliland has demonstrated a steadfast commitment to democratic governance. My Lords, this is not an abstract ideal, but a tangible process evidenced by elections such as the one poised to be held on November the 13th, 2024, 2 weeks' time. Its fourth presidential election since 2003. This commitment to democratic values must be viewed against a backdrop of rising tensions in the broader Horn of Africa. Now, the region is marked by significant security challenges, including the influence of the Houthis in Yemen, Al-Shabaab and ISIS, all of which threaten stability. And the ongoing Houthi conflict, fueled by Iranian arms, disrupts shipping routes across the Gulf of Aden and now poses an increased threat as the Houthis have begun collaborating with Al-Shabaab, arming them with Iranian weapons to extend their reach across borders. Al-Shabaab continues to present a major threat, particularly in regions close to Somaliland's borders, such as Sool, where the group exploits weak governance for recruitment and cross-border incursions. Furthermore, ISIS has established a presence in Puntland, raising alarms about potential infiltration into Somaliland's contested areas. These security dynamics are exacerbated by the region's fragile governance and the vulnerability of marginalised populations, whom terrorists, of course, exploit for recruitment. Here, my Lords, the UK's engagement in counter-terrorism and governance enhancement is not merely beneficial, but is essential. Moreover, the geopolitical landscape is complicated by the actions of key players in the region. Djibouti, a strategic nexus hosting military bases for countries such as the United States, China, and France, plays a crucial role in supporting the economic stability of landlocked Ethiopia. However, Djibouti faces challenges in balancing relationships with these foreign powers while managing regional refugee flows. Eritrea, under President Afwerki's one-party state, has seen a normalisation of relations with Ethiopia since 2018, yet remains, of course, embroiled in human rights abuses and regional conflicts, notably in Tigray. So Ethiopia itself is beset by internal conflicts, in the Tigray, as I've said, and in Somalia, the persistent threat of Al-Shabaab, coupled with political instability and corruption, further complicates the regional landscape. And the reliance on the African Union mission underscores the need for a concerted international effort to address these governance challenges. And at the heart of these rising tensions are territorial and border disputes, such as between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and clashes over contested regions like Sool, Sanag, between Somaliland and Puntland. The dispute between Djibouti and Eritrea over the Dumera mountain and island further illustrates the fragility of regional stability. Internal ethnic tensions in Ethiopia, exacerbated by the Tigray conflict, and violent clashes among various groups pose additional risks of escalation. So, my Lords, Somaliland, amidst these challenges, continues to seek international recognition and investment, highlighting its relatively peace and democratic governance compared to Somalia. The recent provisions of iris biometrical technology by Taiwan makes a commendable step towards ensuring electoral transparency, and Somaliland faces considerable challenges from foreign interference in its elections. Both neighbouring states and external actors see these elections as opportunities to advance their geopolitical interests. Thus, it is critical to support Somaliland in strengthening its electoral integrity, ensuring transparency and fairness while preventing undue foreign influence. Additionally, external influences from Middle Eastern powers such as the UAE and Qatar further complicate local politics. China's expanding presence in the region, particularly its military base in Djibouti and strategic investments, highlights the competing interests of global powers. And as these dynamics play out, we must remain vigilant against the potential for escalating conflicts to ignite broader regional wars, which would have, of course, devastating humanitarian consequences, including famine, disease, and mass displacement. In this complex context, I believe the United Kingdom, with its historical ties and global standing, is uniquely positioned to play a constructive role in Somaliland's future. Recognising independence would not merely acknowledge a political reality, but would strategically align our objectives in the Horn of Africa. Such recognition would signal our commitment to supporting democratic governance, reinforcing stability, and ensuring secure trade routes. Now, critics may argue that such recognition could destabilise the region, yet, my lords, we must question whether adherence to outdated paradigms serves the cause of peace and progress. Supporting Somaliland's independence is not a matter of principle, it aligns with our strategic interests in a region marked by volatility and uncertainty. I spoke in your Lordship's House on the 25th of July about the Ethiopia-Somaliland Memorandum of Understanding, which the Noble Lord referred to. I hope it will turn into a full-scale agreement. And if I may conclude, I will end as I began. The people of Somaliland should not be invisible, most especially here in the UK. And whilst we do not officially recognise their home country, we owe it to recognise them, support their most basic human rights, and wish the country well in their democratic elections in 2 weeks' time.
My Lord, I too welcome the fact that the Government has initiated this debate and thank the Minister for his introduction, and also look forward to Baroness Harman's maiden speech, having had a flat in her former constituency for quite a few years. I'm quite certain that she'd be very welcome in this House, and we're looking forward to hearing what she has to say. And I think, whilst I think what the Noble Lord has said about Somaliland is worthy of consideration and thought, it is a difficult and delicate issue, but it has validity. And just a few points that I think need to be drawn out. As I think quite a few Noble Lords will know, Jan Egeland of the Norwegian Refugee Council was in this House last week and gave a pretty depressing comment on the state of the world. And the very starkest statistic was in the last few years, the number of refugees and internally displaced people in the world has risen from 42 million to 120 million. And whilst that has happened, most of the developed countries have dramatically reduced their aid and support to exactly those people. So as the problem has got worse, support from the international community has been reduced. And we wonder why conflicts escalate and whilst resolutions do not appear. But I do have some knowledge of Ethiopia. I visited it several times. And in the reference to Sudan, I've also visited Sudan and South Sudan. I haven't visited Somalia or Eritrea or Djibouti, but clearly the impact is very much felt whenever you visit the region in any case. And I'm grateful for the fact that Annalise Dodds, the Development Minister, visited Ethiopia in August, and the Minister was there just a week or two ago. And that, I think, demonstrates the government is engaged. I have to point out, however, and he can correct me if my figures are wrong, but from a peak of £300 million a year to Ethiopia in terms of the UK's aid budget, we're currently down to about 83 million. And in the case of Somalia, from a peak of 250 million, it's down to 92.7 million the current year, which just reinforces the point. I know the government's not in a position to reverse that, but they mustn't cut it any further. And I think we want to see that they are beginning to build it back. And this is an area of focus where it's urgently needed. And as the Minister said, it is a very complex region, and the interconnections are very difficult. But he did quite rightly make some positive comments about what those countries are trying to do. Somalia is definitely in a better place than it was a few years ago, but it's not out of the woods. Somaliland is a shining example in one sense, but there is an unresolved problem. I think Eritrea is still a worry. But I think the point I would wish to make is there's 120 million or more people living in Ethiopia. In spite of some reverses in the last few years because of the internal conflicts, Ethiopia has achieved a huge amount since they got rid of the communist government in a whole variety of ways. The poverty indicators have dropped very sharply, health and education has improved, but it has slid because of the conflict in the last few years. But whilst the Prime Minister, maybe his rhetoric isn't helpful, it's quite understandable that a country of 120 million people, which is trying to build a successful economy and has no access to the sea other than by agreement with Djibouti, which has its own problems, is looking for a secure access. It used to have it when it possessed Eritrea. That is not a viable option. So it is understandable why they would look to Somaliland, very close access to the sea and a stable environment. It's equally understandable that Somalia is uncomfortable with that, more than uncomfortable, very angry, if you like. But my appeal to the Minister is both from the UK's point of view and the international community. This is surely something that could be resolved by negotiation and agreement. But the starting point surely has to be that the needs for Ethiopia to have a safe and secure access to the sea is a legitimate aspiration, which it would be helpful if its neighbours could take a constructive attitude to resolving. I can put it no firmly than that. I'm not saying what the answer should be, but I think it's an understandable wish, and refusing to address it doesn't really help get us resolved. As the Minister said, we have the problem of the spillover from Sudan and South Sudan, refugee camps in Ethiopia, and obviously probably the worst humanitarian crisis literally on the planet. It's just worth also making the point, the UK are the UN penholders on Sudan, so we have some reasonable responsibility to try and help resolve that situation. And indeed, lowering the temperature, addressing the issues, getting the parties together is the only way we're going to resolve this. And when you throw in the consequence of climate change and the current famine, it's just an added burden. And I think we all know that it is the 40th anniversary of the famine, but it's important to remember that that famine was to some extent directly caused by the appalling government of the time, part of it deliberately and the rest by neglect. And therefore it is understandable that the government that has succeeded that, even though it's changed in the last few years, is very sensitive to the issue of Ethiopian famine, because they've done an awful lot to try and ensure they can manage famine and stress from their own resources as well as with international aid. And even when it's embarrassing for them, they're prepared to make a public statement that they're facing the prospect of famine and looking for practical support. And I think we should acknowledge that, because it shows that we respect what they're trying to do and are there to try and help, rather than, I think, give this sort of terrible image of Africa as a completely failed continent that can't cope. It's just not true. The scale of the climate change, the extremity of some of the drought, is beyond human control, but not beyond management and resolution. So, and I think the UK government's engagement in the region has been positive and constructive, but regrettable has been rather downgraded in recent years, and that has been noticed. And indeed, I have to say that I was advised that the very, very sharp withdrawal from aid projects in Ethiopia led a minister who in the Ethiopian government to say they weren't sure they wanted to work with the UK government in future because they couldn't trust the continuity. I hope this government, whatever it does, doesn't stop and start. I hope it starts, but if it starts, it doesn't then stop, because that is just the worst way to handle aid and indeed development cooperation on a mutually respectful basis. So the other thing I'd want to say is that there's a tendency for this to become an issue when there's a crisis. So the TV cameras are in, there's news, whatever, there's an appeal. It creates a rather negative image. It's not that it's not real, but secondly, it's surely about long-term solutions. It's about building resilience. It's about building capacity. And therefore, when I had the honour to chair the International Development Committee, I always used to say to people, it is not the Foreign Aid Committee, it's the International Development Committee. Aid is necessary sometimes in an emergency, but it needs to be backed up with sustained development programs to build resilience, to build capacity, to enable countries to have the long-term ability to tackle their own problems. So I do appeal to the government not just to respond to crises, but to set in process programs that have long-term continuity. They don't always get the attention, but they do make the difference. And that's really, really important. And perhaps, and I think I've said before in debates in this House, we need to try and rebuild the cross-party consensus we had. Yeah. Because I think what has happened is we've broken the connection with the British public and the importance and relevance of our overseas development programme in both compassion but also our own internal national interests. We need to rebuild that, because I'm afraid at the moment the attitude tends to be, we've got all these problems at home, we really shouldn't be addressing that. But actually, we'll have more problems at home if you don't address that. We live in a shared, overcrowded, overstressed planet. We're part of the overstressing. We have to be part of the solution too. So I would conclude by saying to the government, I'm appreciated the fact that 2 ministers have been to Ethiopia in very short order. And I hope that that relationship, both with Ethiopia and with the neighbouring territories, will continue. I hope that our role as penholder in Sudan might help us to push that forward. And I would urge the Minister, and perhaps he could in his response say what is being done, as to the extent to which the UK can possibly help with mediation among the countries, particularly between Somaliland and Ethiopia, and perhaps also giving some leadership to the international community. We're not the single most important player, but we have been an important player. We can be again, and I hope that we will be able to recognise that these tensions can be resolved by goodwill. And actually, I've noticed that the rhetoric has been restrained. It's been there, there's been a bit of tub thumping, but they've just held back from escalating it to where it might be a conflict. It could be, but it shouldn't be. This is no justification. Conflict will resolve absolutely nothing, just make a very bad situation a lot worse.
My Lords, I'm pleased to follow the very illuminating and powerful speeches of the noble Lords, Lord Pollack and Lord Bruce, and I thank them for their welcome to me. And I'm more than pleased to find myself joining this House. We have an important job to do, as our task is to scrutinise legislation, hold the government to account, to consider and report upon public policy, and to seek to introduce legislation or propose amendments to bills. I pledge that I will do all that to the best of my ability, working with peers on all sides of the House. And everyone is so nice here. It feels quite different from the Commons. Though I confess it will take me a bit of a while to get used to former members of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet greeting me warmly. And my former ministerial colleagues who are now here are being much nicer to me now than I ever remember them being when we were in government together. I put this down to this being a place of post-ambition politics, and I can highly recommend it. But of course there are so many here who I've worked with closely and have respected over the decades, not least Lord Kinnock, who in an overwhelmingly male-dominated parliamentary Labour Party always backed me, and Baroness Smith, who I've admired since she won Basildon in 1997, and I'd like to thank them for introducing me and for their advice. I'm grateful to Black Rod for her guidance and would ask her to pass on my thanks to all her team who've been so helpful, from the digital services to the library and the doorkeepers and many others. It meant a great deal to me that Black Rod and her team enabled my family to be here when I was introduced last month. When I was introduced in the Commons in 1982, I was pregnant, and it was my husband beaming down at me from the gallery. This time, it was my children and grandchildren up in the public gallery, and even one-year-old baby Reuben was allowed in. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak in this important debate. While the dreadful suffering in the Middle East and the appalling invasion of Ukraine by Putin has seized the world's attention, there has nonetheless also been a steady focus in this House on the suffering in the Horn of Africa. I fully support the Minister in making that the case and pay tribute to his speech in the debate last month and the many other excellent speeches in that debate, most particularly by the most Reverend Prelate, the Archbishop of Canterbury. During the 40 years I was an MP, Camberwell and Peckham became home to many from the Horn of Africa. I learned from them about the tragic waste of lives and the suffering which propelled them to leave their home and seek a better life here for themselves and their families, and I valued the contribution they make to this country. I visited the Horn of Africa out of respect for them and to get to know their homeland, and grew to understand not only the critical role of our development aid, which Lord Bruce spoke about, but also the crucial importance of the money they send back from the often low pay that they earn here. Those who send remittances for the welfare of those in conflict-blighted homelands are truly the hidden heroes of international development, and I hope the new government will recognise that and facilitate their contributions. As we debate the many problems in the region, we must have at the forefront of our minds the absolute need to tackle the monstrous abuse that is female genital mutilation. Across the Horn of Africa, millions of women are living with the consequences of the brutality of FGM. Somalia and Somaliland have an almost universal rate of FGM. It is inflicted on all women. It's rife in Ethiopia, Djibouti and Sudan too. FGM is cutting, scraping and cauterizing procedures to remove the external female genitalia. And it's carried out on girls from as young as infancy up until the age of 15. The pain inflicted by it does not stop after the initial procedure, but continues with bleeding, infections, shock, difficulty in passing urine, in having sex, and childbirth. I pay tribute to those in the region who challenge the taboo subject of FGM, and those here too from the diaspora community who fearlessly speak out against it. Our new Development Minister, Annalise Dodds, is also Minister for Women, and I know that she will make this a priority. We should recognise that eradication of FGM and empowerment of women with a new generation of women leaders will bring new prospects to the region. There are now many women in this House who are proud feminists, and I look forward to continuing to work with them. But in conclusion, and ever hopeful, I want to say I'm on the lookout here for male allies of feminism. Not so that you can decide our agenda, heaven forbid, not so that you can lead us, we're more than capable of doing that ourselves, but so that you can actively back us in our work as we go forward to greater equality for women.
My Lords, I begin by commending, thanking and congratulating my noble friend, Lady Harman of Peckham, on her maiden speech today, a speech demonstrably characterised by great experience, wisdom and insight. I will not attempt to be the feminist from the male sex in this speech. I'm too much of a coward in this environment. Occasionally, my lords, I'm deluded about regarding myself as an experienced parliamentarian, with 13 years in the other place and 11 years in your lordship's house, taking into account the fact that I had 3 years leave of absence. But next to someone who served in the House of Commons for, is it 40 or 42 years? 40 years. My noble friend says it's 40 years, and she will know because she's probably counted them all. Making her, as I understand it, the second longest serving female MP in British history, after my noble friend Baroness Beckett, whom I'm delighted to see in her place today, and ending as the mother of the house. I'm forced to regard myself as something of a neophyte in this sort of company. Not less extraordinary is the fact that on ending such a distinguished tenure, my noble friend promptly has taken up another role and entered your lordship's house. Indeed, perhaps only in politics could the one essay this somewhat Benjamin Button-esque transformation from being the mother of one house to an eager thrusting new arrival in the other. My lords, I could easily fill my allotted time by rehearsing the details of my noble friend's distinguished career. You'll be glad to hear I won't. In my time in politics, I can scarcely think of a better fit between a job and its holder than her time as the First Minister for Women. Her role in driving the adoption of the 2010 Equality Act will long be remembered and long celebrated. And her service as Deputy Leader and Chair of the Labour Party was undertaken with commitment and distinction. But the golden thread running through her career is a passionate commitment to equality and the protection of the human dignity of every individual. That consistency of purpose and sheer doggedness tell me that she is an invaluable addition to your lordship's house, and that she will command respect and attention in all her interventions in our proceedings. My lords, I thank my noble friend, the Minister, not merely for affording us the opportunity to consider this motion today, but also for the characteristically wise and well-informed speech with which he opened today's debate. My lords, I called for a full debate in government time on the situation in the Horn of Africa in oral questions on the 10th of this month. Whether the scheduling of today's debate is causation or coincidence, I join other noble lords in welcoming the opportunity to turn the full glare of our attention on the conflicts that disfigure some parts of the Horn of Africa and the splintering peace in others. It's perhaps understandable, but no less regrettable, that in general conflicts in this part of the world are ill served by international reporting and consequently receive a very small percentage of global attention. I don't propose to enter into the question of why, for instance, the deaths of around 20,000 in the Sudanese civil war since April 2023 has excited such an extraordinarily small fraction of the international emotion and indignation that has focused around Ukraine and the Middle East over the last couple of years. But I do think it's something that might repay a little thought. Finland's foreign minister rightly warned about the dangers of Ukraine fatigue 2 weeks ago. Those who are victims of state-sponsored violence, repression, or of militia groups in the Horn of Africa would welcome even a fraction of the apparently attenuating Western attention that is focused on Ukraine. Mindful of the debate on the 40th anniversary of the Ethiopian famine and the many forensic and moving contributions from noble lords on that occasion, I would like to focus the first part of my remarks on Eritrea. Your Lordship's House will be aware that on the 10th of October, the Presidents of Egypt, Somalia and Eritrea met in Asmara to sign a joint statement which pledged the three participants to work together for strategic cooperation in all fields. That designedly vague phraseology should give us pause. But if precedent is any guide, we can expect an intensification of mutual military aid and the coordination largely directed against Ethiopia. Indeed, even before the summit concluded, Egypt had sent 2 armed shipments to Somalia to reduce their reliance on Ethiopian forces in fighting al-Shabaab. The communique that followed the summit underlined tripartite agreement on, and I read this short, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries in the region. Though cloaked in the cool objectivity of diplomatic language, this was a pretty clear disavowal of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's coastal ambitions and the MOU Ethiopia has concluded with Somaliland. Such agreements serve only to normalise Eritrea and its regime, but Eritrea consistently has acted as a destabilising force in the region. Not only is it a one-party, but it is now a one-family state, with President Isaias frequently having signalled his intention that his son should succeed him. It ranks last out of 180 countries in the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. It sits 161st out of 180 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. The UN Special Rapporteur describes severe control exercised by the state over every aspect of civil and personal life. Daily repression clouds the lives of all Eritreans. Thousands of political prisoners within Eritrea are subject to torture and sexual violence. 300,000 individuals are subjected to forced labour, and almost half of Eritrea's population is forced into military service, which can last for decades. These statistics detailing internal repression within Eritrea are grim enough, but the recent diplomatic alignment with Egypt and Somalia is doubly concerning given Eritrea's long record of intensifying regional conflicts or fanning them into flame. Eritrea's President Isaias has a record of plotting attacks against neighbouring states, despite having won independence from Ethiopia as recently as 1993. Eritrea has already engaged in conflict with Yemen, Sudan and Djibouti, while recently offering intermittent support to Al-Shabaab. With all of that in mind, could the Minister tell us what assessment the Government has made of the potential benefits or drawbacks of sanctioning individual members of the Eritrean Government and the Eritrean Defence Force who have involved themselves in serious human rights violations in Tigray and in Eritrea, their own country itself? I'd also welcome any comments my noble friend might wish to share on the subject of Eritrea's diplomatic closeness with Beijing. Only last month, President Isaias attended the Beijing summit and was greeted both by the Premier Li Qiang of the State Council and a warm statement committing to further Sino-Eritrean cooperation under the auspices of the Belt and Road Initiative. I mention this not merely because it's a further supervening diplomatic complication, but because these economic ties to China and the states in the Gulf render our sanctions many times less effective than otherwise they would be. Focusing my attention thus far on Eritrea and its increasing gravitation towards Somalia and Egypt, but as other noble lords have reminded us, the start of this phase of escalation is at least partly consequent upon the MOU signed by Ethiopia and Somaliland. The expansionist ambitions of President Abiy Ahmed are placing a severe strain on relations with Somalia. They're pulling other regional powers, including Egypt and Turkey, into the orbit of this diplomatic crisis and have fashioned an ideal context in which Al-Shabaab recruitment and funding have spiked. But of course, the quid pro quo for coastal access in the MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland is the recognition of Somali independence. Of course, I do understand those who point to the cultural distinctiveness, the resilience of civil society, the 6 democratic elections and peaceful transfers of power in Somaliland as factors that should impel this country to recognise Somaliland independence, but I worry about the consequences. A senior advisor to the Somali president, speaking under condition of anonymity, told the world that Somalia is prepared to countenance war with Ethiopia over the deal. In June, Somalia announced that they would expel thousands of Ethiopian troops deployed against Al-Shabaab unless the deal was scrapped by the end of this year. Compounding that capacity problem in quelling terrorism, the Institute for the Study of War released an analysis last month which suggested that an intensification of Egyptian military support for Somalia will destabilise the region and hinder operations designed to counter Al-Shabaab. In such a febrile situation, what precedent would a UK recognition of Somaliland aspirations set? Were we to indulge in a unilateral recognition of Somaliland independence. It's not only possible but probable, but this would be seen as an implicit endorsement for the separatist aspirations of a host of other groups and regions across the Horn of Africa. In other quarters, it may well be greeted as a piece of high-minded neo-colonialism, pushing states who are engaged in conflict with separatists in their own populations further into the arms of China, Russia, and other strategic adversaries. No UN member state has recognised Somaliland's claim of independence, and earlier this year their government began the process of appealing to the International Court of Justice. It would surely be destabilising to preempt or possibly disavow that judgment by proceeding unilaterally. The Ethiopia-Somaliland MOU stipulates that Ethiopia can lease a 20-kilometre coastline in Somaliland's Odal region for 50 years to build its naval base. But that region within Somaliland is dominated by the Isa clan, who have protested vigorously against this deal, accused the Somali government of selling their land, and threatened war if the agreement is not rescinded. This is another reminder, if one were needed, of the intense complexities that shape the politics of this region. The Lordship's House will record the Edwardian satirist Saki, who wrote in 1911 describing countries in the Balkans as producing more history than they can consume locally. We all knew what happened, what followed 3 years later. I believe the same remark could be applied to this region with all its complexity, ethnic, religious, cultural and political affiliations that do not conform neatly with national boundaries. In closing, I'd like to reiterate my admiration for the vigour with which my noble friend the Minister, the Foreign Secretary and others have pursued a course of de-escalation in the Horn of Africa in the few short months that they've been imposed. With that in mind, I'd like to close by asking my noble friend what consideration the Government is given to ongoing participation in the EU's CSDP missions, including that in Somalia. Given that international unity is the best means we have of mitigating humanitarian impact of regional divisions and conflicts, such a step, while small, may well enable us better to ease these conflicts in the medium to longer term.
It gives me particular pleasure to be speaking in this debate so that I can congratulate the noble Lady Baroness Harman on her maiden speech, and just to say that it's nice to be back close again, because of course we shared neighbouring constituencies for over 30 years, and it's a delight to see you here, and I'm very, very pleased that you will continue the amazing work that you've done over the years on women's rights. I also want to say to the noble Lord Collins that it's really genuinely grateful to having this kind of debate, and I hope that this will be perhaps a way that we can do this in other parts of Africa. I mean, it would be really lovely if we could get a proper debate on Zimbabwe, as he knows, but I would thank him, and his and other peers tonight have given a very comprehensive view of what's actually happening in the Horn of Africa. And we've seen over the past number of years tensions rising, the civil war in Sudan, which continues to destabilise, the drought for over 3 years, food shortage, all of these things, and worryingly the increasing numbers of various terrorist groups that seem to be escalating their fundraising and recruitment. Now, I want to say something about the one country in the region that gives us hope, and add some remarks to what the noble Lord Pollock has already said. And of course, I'm talking about Somaliland. And I think it is important that we remind peers and others who listen to this debate that just a slight bit of history, because in 1960, Somaliland emerged as an independent country from the British Empire after many years as British Somaliland. And after that, it very quickly took steps to merge with what was then the trust territory of Somaliland, historically the Italian Somaliland, to form a union. And there was originally huge optimism and hope of creating a country where all Somalis could come together and live together peacefully. Sadly, that didn't happen. Things got worse. Military dictatorships based in Mogadishu and discrimination against those in northern Somalia with the attacks on civilians, the mass killings, the genocide, Somali jets bombing parts of northern Somalia and destroying Hargeisa, almost destroying completely that city. But out of those decades of horror, Somaliland declared itself free of Somalia in a declaration of independence back in 1991. And now, for the last 33 years, that proud country has been asking for the world to recognise it. It's doing everything that we in the Western world and Western democracies continue to flag up as showing what a democratic, free country should be doing. It has regular, as we mentioned, free and fair elections, and in a couple of weeks we're going to see their 6th presidential election. And like those before, I hope, and I'm sure they will, be peaceful. It has an active civil society. It's made huge strides on the advancement of women's rights, even beginning to tackle what the Noble Lady Baroness Harman mentioned, the scourge in that area, female genital mutilation. And the current president is even considering banning FGM altogether. All sexual violence and rape acts go through the criminal justice system and are not, as elsewhere in the region, dealt with by community or customary law, which have been outlawed. And it has a strong and fair justice system and religious tolerance. Indeed, in this whole region, independent Somaliland is the only beacon for democracy and the rule of law, and we should be lauding what they have achieved. And yet, despite that progress, their achievements and their loyalty to the United Kingdom, and let's not forget how many Somalis died, sacrificed during the Second World War when they joined us in fighting fascism. In spite of all of that, we always find reasons to procrastinate and not officially recognise it. And I find it interesting that when I had a question a couple of weeks ago as to the possibility of the UK recognising Somaliland, one or two peers were urging so much caution that it seemed they didn't even want to discuss Somaliland, and almost implied that those of us who raised it were being reckless. It was also very telling that in the response to the minister's response, the Noble Lord Howell of Guildford was able to point out that the same answer had been given to him to read out on the question of Somaliland being recognised when he was minister at least 10 years ago. So I think that should give us food for thought, because there obviously hasn't been much change in the Foreign Office briefings over those years. Now, I'm aware, and of course we all are, of the complexity, as been mentioned by other peers, of the region. And that does cause the Foreign Office officials and Foreign Office ministers to be careful, very careful in their diplomatic efforts. It doesn't, of course, stop other countries from looking after their own interests first. And we're seeing, of course, now the beginning of China getting very much involved in the Horn of Africa, and having said publicly that it's geographically strategic importance to them, it's got abundant resources and enormous potential, and they've now got a special envoy. I want to say something about aid, because aid that's been going direct, aid should be going, any aid that we're giving should be going directly to the people of Somaliland rather than via Somalia, where it is used as a political tool. And we remember that during the COVID pandemic, vaccines earmarked for Somaliland were deliberately delayed in Mogadishu, released only hours before they expired. And this did expose the politicisation of humanitarian aid. And state-directed aid is also typically routed through Somalia. And understandably, the Somalian government has repeatedly declared it neither can nor will accept development or budgetary support filtered through Somalia's federal government. They view that as an affront to a country that is running itself freely and successfully. We should be rewarding good governance and using Somaliland as a beacon to show the rest of the region what can be achieved. Now, Human Rights Watch produced a brief for this debate which highlights all the terrible atrocities and obscenities and human rights abuses that are taking place in Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia. And just like the Noble Lord Pollock said earlier, the word Somaliland in the Human Rights Watch wasn't even mentioned. And that's, I mean, clearly they have not wanted to distinguish between Somalia and Somaliland, and I think that is very, very sad that the benefits of what's been happening there are not being put forward. And our government's position seems to be, as mentioned in the Lords recently, that it's up to Somaliland to negotiate with Somalia. The Minister said in the questions recently, it is absolutely an issue for Somalia to resolve. Well, I just think that is actually not feasible at all. And if we look at what's happening in Somalia, the idea that they will suddenly say, or even after a lot of negotiations say, Somaliland, you can be independent and we will recognise you. But I think the idea that we're setting a precedent, and I know that that's been mentioned by a noble lord, that we're setting a precedent if we recognise it. But surely the Somaliland situation is unique because they were independent. They recognised back in 1960. And there would probably be a backlash from Somalia, but I believe that recognition by us would be followed very quickly by other Western countries, including the United States, and that this would actually encourage those people in Somalia who really want to see changes. It would encourage them to engage in dialogue. Surely we should be supporting and encouraging democracy around the world. And recognition, to me, is not just a moral imperative, but it would give the United Kingdom a strategic advantage that aligns with our foreign policy goals. It would be the first step to promote peace, stability and democracy in the entire Horn of Africa, benefiting all their people. And I know that the noble Lord Collins is looking at this very carefully, as was said in the short debate we had on Africa some time ago. And I would urge our new government to look at this again, to be brave, not to wait till somebody else goes. Let's be the first. Let's recognise what Somaliland has done and can do, and how that could play a real part in improving the terrible situation that we've got in that region.
My Lords, this part of Africa represents an area where the United Kingdom has interests. Interests as far as the global combating of terrorism, very strong diaspora communities across many parts of the United Kingdom, and, of course, access on the Red Sea for key trading routes for the United Kingdom is fundamentally important to our economy. It is also an area where the UK has values, because a thread throughout this debate has been the humanitarian crisis that exists, and we debated it last week in the debate of my noble friend Baroness Featherstone, and the debate on the Sustainable Development Goals for Lord McConnell, and previously, as the Minister referred, the debate that we had on Sudan. Therefore, I thank very much the Minister for bringing this debate to the Chamber. A causal effect from the noble Lord Brown's question, calling for it. Now that I know how it happens, then I'm taking lessons about these. The debate allowed us an opportunity to have, for at least a little part of it, packed government benches who took an interest in the Horn of Africa aspect. I think it might be because of the outstanding contribution from the new member for Baroness Harman, and as the noble Lord Brown had indicated, the fact that we've had in this debate the two longest standing female MPs in British history is a great credit to this House, and the fact that she chose this debate and raised the powerful message of FGM and will be a campaigner on this. Hopefully we will see the reversal of the previous administration's cuts in global FGM support. Then her contributions will be extremely powerful. Count me in as a supporter for her work, even though I'm having to adjust to me now being in a post-ambition part of my political career, but thank you very much. Many of my colleagues have said that for quite a while. The MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland is of importance. I was really glad that the Minister gave precedence to that, because this isn't some form of debate about a race for recognition or a glib element of because it had been part of a British colonial past, then it deserves our recognition now. There are sensitive diplomatic talks brokered by Turkey between Somalia and Ethiopia. These are of significance. There is no clear diplomatic breakthrough. And as the noble Lord Brown had indicated, the alternative, and my noble friend Lord Bruce, the alternative to diplomatic work is fearful. And therefore, I think we do have to guard against language saying that there could be a backlash. This is an area where, as we heard, not only the worst famine in a generation, the most displaced people in a generation, the very sensitive geopolitical talks that are happening that could lead potentially in certain areas to tribal conflict, then those aspects do. I think we should bear those in mind, notwithstanding the fact that we should not shy away from debating the issue. The MOU recognising potentially Somaliland by Ethiopia in return for Red Sea access, both potentially naval and commercial, yet not clear in my mind which is the most significant priority for Ethiopia yet. But the point that I wanted to stress on this is it's not just the MOU, it's also with Egypt signing a military and security and defence pact between Egypt and Somalia, signed in August. It's the two should be considered together as far as the sensitivity, in my view. And that is why it is important that it is recognising that the neighbouring countries in Somalia, as part of the African Union peacekeeping mission, should be relevant for consideration as well. So I wanted to ask the Minister with regards to the UK position for ATMIS, because there are Ethiopian troops in Somalia as part of ATMIS. It isn't the case of just these on neighbouring countries. These are where there are troops in country. The mandate for ATMIS is up for renewal at the end of the year. Ethiopia has said that they may not want to be part of it, but they may seek to have Egypt filling a gap as far as potentially having troops as part of the AU force. What is the government's assessment as far as the continuation of ATMIS or an AU-sponsored force? Will it likely have a replenishment of the force capability? Are there other countries that could be troop-contributing countries? I previously raised in the Chamber the fact that the UK was the lead contributing donor country to ATMIS with its primary mission on supporting our combat against Al-Shabaab. And the Minister had, I jotted it down because I quite liked the slight bit of officialdom saying that the UK was seeking a sustainable and broader-based source of funding. That may be true, but the reality is that's to infill from the cuts from donor countries that have pulled away from it. So are we confident that the force will actually have a replenishment of its funding? Because as far as I understand, that is not clear yet. I hope that the UK will be able to be a contributing factor to the successor for ATMIS. And will we seek the continuation of Resolution 2719 as far as any successor organisation? Because I'm very clear that any uncertainty, any division, any complexities, the potential victor of this will be Al-Shabaab. I want to raise just two other wider aspects before close, because this is an opportunity to talk about some elements of economic development too. It's not all just seeing through the lens of conflict. And I wanted to touch on some elements of debt, because Somalia is a case study as to how, on paper, debt reconstructuring, debt moving away from debt servicing costs can look good, but then the net impact is not necessarily as beneficial as we would want it to be. Somalia has had a successful debt restructuring, had a $4.5 billion debt relief from the IMF and World Bank, and it reduced the debt ratio of 64 to 6% of GDP, which on paper is outstanding. But health spending in Somalia has almost halved over this period. So when we are debating, validly so, and I know that this is one of the government's priorities of looking at tackling debt servicing costs, how are we ensuring that if that is happening, then there is ultimately better investment in education and in health services? Because we've seen that if we move purely towards private sector reissuing of bonds, the likelihood, if it's not through concessional rates, there will be higher rates. We've seen it in neighbouring Kenya, where there was a reissuing of bonds at 11% interest rates, which is now being through the entire economy, and we saw the tension recently within Kenya. And I hope, since I'm going to copy the Noble Lord Brown, which is to ask for debate, I hope at some stage we may have an opportunity of discussing the wider aspect of debt and debt servicing, because I think all parties are now seeking to be seized of this, and it is a valid issue to discuss. Finally, I want to just close on the point that the Noble Lord of the Minister referred to Sudan. He was very generous with his time yesterday to meet the former civilian Prime Minister of Sudan with myself, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, and the leader Khalid Omar of the Takadoum, the civilian front, for a discussion. He's in London at the moment to take part in the FT summit. I hope that part of the debate that we are having in Parliament on Sudan will be increased focus, increased interest, and that will spell out to the public. I have been pursuing the Disasters Emergency Committee, who have 3 criteria for triggering an appeal. This is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The third triggering element, they have told me, is not being met, which is that there's sufficient awareness among the public. And that, to me, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if we can do anything in Parliament, it can be saying that we are aware and we want to raise it, and I think the great British public will be generous if there is an appeal for it. So I will repeat my appeal to them publicly that we can trigger this. The priorities are perfectly clear that the civilians have for protection of civilians, for there to be a ceasefire and a political process. The UK, not only penholder, but the presidency coming up of the Security Council, is in the prime position. I'll close on the fact that I recall in 2012, when previously we debated Somalia in Parliament, there was a London summit on Somalia, because we knew then, and I give credit to William Hague as Foreign Secretary, we knew then that if Somalia was going to fall foul of terrorism, weak neighbours, displaced people and hunger, then that would be an impact on Britain. We used our convening power, we put effort into it, we put diplomatic effort into it, we did it on focus, we did it on scale, and we led up to it, and we delivered, and we had funding. Perhaps for the protection of civilians in Sudan, a London summit during the UK presidency of the Security Council might be the appropriate thing that we can do. And I look forward to the Minister's response.
Well, my Lords, I personally thank all Noble Lords for their contributions. It's been another outstanding debate in your Lordship's House, and I thank Lord Collins, the Minister, for bringing forward this debate in the first place. I want to start by joining with others in commending the Noble Baroness Harman, for what I thought was a quite outstanding maiden speech. The Noble Lady has had a quite remarkable parliamentary career in the other place, and their loss is very definitely our gain. And I was just thinking that with the Noble Lady and Baroness Beckett and Baroness May of Maidenhead that made her maiden speech last week, I was starting to think that I think we men need to up our game a bit if we're going to compete with all these excellent women joining us from the other place. I particularly like the Noble Lady's remark that this is a post-ambition house, and I can assure her that for those of us that until not too long ago were sitting on the other side in government, that is certainly true in my particular case. But an excellent contribution. We look forward to the many excellent contributions that I'm sure she will make in the years to come. My Lords, on these benches we hold, of course, a long-standing commitment, like most others, to upholding international law, to supporting peaceful resolutions to global conflicts, and it is from that stance that we approach today's debate. As Lord Collins outlined in his introduction, tensions have increased greatly since the signing of the partnership this January between Ethiopia and Somaliland. And whilst it is important, of course, to recognise, as many others have done, Ethiopia's desire as a landlocked nation for improved trade routes to boost its economy, we must also recognise the ramifications of them engaging with Somaliland. Somaliland is indeed a fascinating territory with much to commend it, as my noble friend Lord Pollack reminded us, with many democratic features. It is, of course, much more sustainable than the rest of Somalia. Of course, it is not currently internationally recognised as independent and still considered part of Somalia, even though in practice, of course, it is not. I do believe that the time is fast approaching when we need to reconsider that long-standing Foreign Office policy and it's been throughout all parties for many years now, but I think Somaliland has proved itself worthy of further consideration. This decision has not only heightened tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia, but has also, of course, highlighted the enduring, complex nature of Somaliland's political status, as the noble lady Baroness Hoey reminded us in her contribution. We should, of course, urge Ethiopia and Somalia to engage constructively through diplomatic channels. We should do whatever we can to help to avoid escalation. I think it's a cause for concern that Turkey's mediation efforts in July and August did not lead to a satisfactory agreement. So I'd like to ask the noble Lord, the Minister, whether himself or his colleagues in the department have had conversations with Turkey, the African Union or the United Nations to help to facilitate that dialogue. Should Ethiopia and Somalia refuse to cooperate, of course, they risk further destabilising what is already a very unstable region, where more than 20 million people are already in desperate need of food assistance due to prolonged droughts and the destabilising impact of the ongoing Sudanese civil war. The stakes, my lords, are extremely high. I think it's tempting to remark that could we really make the situation any worse by recognising Somaliland? Maybe this is an opportunity that will prompt the rest of the nations there into further actions. The situation becomes precarious with Somalia's recent security pact with Egypt and Eritrea, nations whose historical tensions with Ethiopia are well documented. Egypt's delivery of arms to Somalia, its willingness to support Somali forces with Egyptian troops, is indeed deeply alarming. With nations in the region rallying around different sides, there is, of course, a high risk of conflict expanding beyond a diplomatic dispute into a full-scale regional crisis. So in this context, I also ask the noble Lord, the Minister, in his summing up, to tell us what steps the government is taking to counterbalance many of these concerning developments and help to ensure the de-escalation of any military ambitions. As I said earlier, previous governments of both parties have followed the standard Foreign Office line and have refrained from supporting Somaliland's independence to avoid potentially stirring further instability. I do think it's about time that we reviewed this policy, respecting, of course, international norms, but recognising the unique relationships with diplomatic ties that we have built across the region. Somaliland has successfully demonstrated stability and self-governance in recent years, and we should commend them and recognise these strides. Of course, we must proceed with caution, but I do agree with my noble friend Lord Pollack that it could well be about time to reconsider that stance. I would also like to ask the noble Lord the Minister whether the government is considering additional steps to help to marshal our soft power in promoting stability in the Horn of Africa. The noble Lord the Minister's colleague, Baroness Chapman, previously mentioned that she would be reviewing our soft power strategy in the region. So I'd be grateful if the noble Lord in his summation could give the House further information and further elaboration on whether there have been any further developments in that regard. British engagement must not simply stop at diplomatic appeals, but should encompass initiatives that address humanitarian needs, and they are considerable, economic cooperation and institution building across the Horn of Africa. In conclusion, my lords, we of course cannot ignore the severe humanitarian challenges arising from drought, conflict and food shortages in that region, which have placed millions in a state of considerable insecurity. And we do urge the Government, the Noble Minister, to act in accordance with international law, to consult with regional partners and do all that the UK Government can to ease the considerable tensions in the region.
Lords, can I thank everyone for their contributions? I think it's been an excellent debate, but like other noble lords, I have to start first with congratulating my noble friend Baroness Harman for her excellent maiden speech. She and I go back a long way, even before she was elected in Parliament, so we've been friends for many, many years. I would only warn her one thing about, this idea of a post-ambition politics. I've realised that I've had many post-ambitions jobs, and every time I think I've finished one, I end up with another. So I'm determined to sort of follow through in terms of looking forward to new challenges. And I think what she displayed in her maiden speech, that still strong passion for changing and challenging inequalities and also championing feminism. And let me reassure her, and she knows this, I will always be a very strong ally in support of her feminist ambitions. But I will also say, in terms of the passion she's raised in terms of FGM, we are committed to working hard to ending this disgraceful thing, and we will be continuing to support groups and to ensure that we can end this practice. And we are supporting grassroots organisations and activists, not only in Africa but in this country too, to challenge that practice. So I congratulate her on that excellent speech, and I know she'll make many, many more. Can I just say that this has been a really thought-provoking debate, a debate that's highlighted the tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia, which do, of course, remain high and risk drawing in the wider region, damaging the prospects for growth and stability. And just to echo the comments of the Noble Lord Bruce, that's what we're determined to focus on, the positive opportunities that region offers. It does offer growth and opportunity, and we're determined to sort of focus on our partnership to do that. But we have to acknowledge it is a region that is beset with a range of challenges, from climate change, conflict and terrorism. All of these issues were central to my recent visit to Ethiopia, where I met the Ethiopian Prime Minister to discuss the full range of our relationship. And this included plans to implement the cessation of hostilities agreement that brought the Tigray conflict to an end, as well as steps we could take to de-escalate tensions in the region. I also underlined the United Kingdom's respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Somalia with him. This is a critical time for the Horn of Africa as the African Union's current mission comes to an end, and we must protect the region's stability, and the United Kingdom will continue to call for dialogue and de-escalation to avoid that dangerous escalation. So let me share some examples to demonstrate how the United Kingdom is helping. I'll take each region in turn, beginning with Somalia. And the United Kingdom is one of Somalia's closest and long-standing partners, and we remain committed to building a safer, freer and more secure country for all Somalis. I welcome steps that they are taking towards these goals, including their huge achievement in clearing arrears to international financial institutions last year, putting it on a sound footing to rebuild the economy, having overcome so many challenges. And as Somalia's debt relief champion, the United Kingdom has worked side by side with their government to reach this milestone. We've also helped Somalia strengthen its economy and create livelihoods and jobs for marginalised groups, especially women, girls and young people. Ranked the second most vulnerable country to climate change globally, Somalia has experienced severe climate events ranging from El Nino rains and flooding to prolonged drought, as we've heard in this debate. And naturally, this has had significant impact on industries and livelihoods. This is why the United Kingdom has driven forward discussion to support fragile states like Somalia to access climate change finance in the face of soaring adaptation needs and protracted humanitarian crises. This includes being an anchor donor to support their accession to the Task Force on Access to Climate Finance. Finally, we are working on multiple fronts to help Somalia tackle the key challenges they face from continuing efforts to degrade al-Shabaab and supporting Somali plans to drive economic growth, addressing the immediate pressures facing communities vulnerable to climate shocks. And we remain a long-term champion to its people and its future. Can I just say, in relation to Lord Purvis's question on the ATMIS project, Ethiopia, is a key contributor to Somalia's security through its troops, as he says, through the AU peace support operation. And it's a significant bilateral presence, and we welcome Ethiopia's contribution to ATMIS and any successor mission. In specific response to his question, we encourage a smooth transition from the current AU peace support operation to a future mission in 2025 that can support Somali security and stability and protect those hard-won gains. The AU and Somali federal government have proposed a new peace support operation called the African Union Support and Stabilisation Mission in Somalia, awesome. We support this, and we are planning planning is underway. There does, as the Noble Lord pointed out, remain a significant funding gap for the new mission, and our least conservative estimates put it in the region of tens of millions of dollars. And we continue to work with stakeholders to urgently address this, both bilaterally and multilaterally. Certainly in all my conversations with African Union officials, it is to ensure that we do get that support. We can't continue with the current arrangement, and therefore it's important we have broader support. Can I just sort of focus on Noble Lord's questions on Somaliland? The UK's long-standing position, as the Noble Lord pointed out, alongside others in the international community, we do not recognise Somaliland's unilateral declaration of independence. It is for Somalia, including Somaliland, to resolve Somaliland's status through dialogue between authorities in both capital cities. It's not for the United Kingdom to determine. Nevertheless, I would point out to the Noble Lord Pollock and the Baroness Hoey that we do have a strong relationship with Somaliland. We work closely with their government to enhance its stability and promote economic, social and human development. I certainly met officials in their government. And ahead of their presidential election on the 13th of November, we will be supporting the National Electoral Commission and international observer missions, because holding peaceful, free and fair elections will be crucial in ensuring that we avoid further conflict in the region. Now, the Noble Lord Callanan asked me about what we are doing in terms of like-minded partners in regard to the MOU, and we regularly discuss these issues, working together with international partners, including the US, to encourage dialogue between Ethiopia and Somalia. And we also, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, welcome Turkish efforts to which have created space for that dialogue. And we will hope that Ethiopia and Somalia will continue to talk so that we can find a mutually acceptable solution to and reduce tensions. Turning to Ethiopia, we have had a long and shared history, and it's easily one of our closest development partners. We've worked to support Ethiopia's recent IMF and World Bank programs, and we provide support to its ambitious economic reform program. It's a partnership rooted in trust and mutual respect. And as Lord Bruce said, it's a country that is central to the stability of the Horn of Africa. And there can hardly be better proof of this than, as I've said, in terms of its long-standing commitment to the African Union's mission in Somalia. Of course, Ethiopia has its challenges, many of which I witnessed during my recent visit. That's why we are taking steps to alleviate humanitarian suffering, including that caused by conflict, and help rebuild people's livelihoods. I recently announced funding for the National Demobilisation and Remigration Programme supporting ex-combatants back into civilian life, and the next phase of our industrialisation focused on Accelerate programme, which will help rebuild Tigray's economy. I met those ex-combatants. I saw the damage that war has caused, and also realised the huge ambition that those people want for a better world and a better country. But I know it's not enough, and we have to go further to end the ongoing conflicts in Amhara and Oromia and implement its transitional justice policy, all of which the United Kingdom stands ready to support. It's vital that Ethiopia, along others, strives to find a mutually acceptable solution to current tensions whilst respecting the territorial integrity of Somalia. In spite of these tensions, as I said, just picking up the point that the Noble Lord Bruce made, the Horn of Africa remains an area of endless possibilities. It's a region with the most incredibly community-led innovations and solutions to problems. It's clear that there is a strong appetite for growth and enterprise, and the United Kingdom partners with regional governments and the private sector on a wide range of bilateral and multilateral programs covering health, education, economic development, security and resilience. And we're pleased to join the Horn of Africa initiative as one of the 5 development partners last year. The initiative provides a platform for cooperation across the region, led by member states which include Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia, Eritrea, South Sudan and Sudan. The menace of violent extremism, conflict and climate shocks are problems that span national borders and require a united approach. And we're working closely with members, including through our £15 million Deres Vanang programme, to build stability and end the scourge of al-Shabaab in the border areas between Kenya, Somalia and Ethiopia. Efforts are going a long way to enabling the Horn of Africa to truly unlock its potential. Can I just, my noble friend asked the question about ongoing participation in the CSDP missions, including that in Somalia, and we're working closely alongside the federal government of Somalia on course security partners, including Turkey and the US. He asked us what assessment we are making in terms of the Eritrea-Ethiopia relationships with China, and we'll continue to urge all stakeholders to support dialogue and de-escalation and refrain from words that or actions that fuel further tensions in the region. And we're drawing on a range of levers to pursue UK objectives and deliver UK policy that builds that resilience in those countries. And of course, Noble Lord Pollock and the Noble Lord Bruce raised the question about the Djibouti-Ethiopia relationship, in particular relation access to the sea. And of course, the two countries are interdependent rather. Ethiopia gets more than 90% of its imported goods via Djibouti port, and Djibouti gets the bulk of its electricity and portable water from Ethiopia. And there have been tensions in the last year over Ethiopia's desire to gain access to a Red Sea port. But these tensions and these things need to be addressed through dialogue and not unilateral demands. I think one of the things that I want to sort of focus on is that we do need to continue to encourage all parties to engage in dialogue and de-escalate existing tensions. And we do need to allow for the positive and constructive relationships necessary for the region to enjoy peace, stability and mutual prosperity. And we have to do that in the spirit of genuine partnership, respect and equality at the heart of our approach, because that's the only way we're going to be delivering meaningful progress. But let me reassure Noble Lords that this debate is only the start of many. I think it's really important that we engage on a cross-party basis to address these issues. And certainly we'll have an opportunity tomorrow, I think, to discuss further Sudan. But I think, as the Noble Lord Purvis recognised, we may be focused on the conflict in terms of the generals and the warring factions, but there is a very strong civil society, and His Excellency Mr. Hamdok is just one example, and we need to continue to support those civil society actors because they're determined to represent the interests of their people, and we should do all in our power to ensure they can do that. And I thank all Noble Lords for their contributions.
Well done. The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, the contents have it.
Move the adjournment.
Yes, you stand up and do it.
Sorry. I wasn't warned about this. I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.